I think most of you know myself. I've had a chance to meet you at some point, but for those who don't, my name is Scott Fash. I took over as the Executive Director of BILD Alberta in January of last year, after spending about the previous 4 years in a few different roles within the associations, but all centered kind of around the advocacy side of things. I think it's safe to say it's been a pretty interesting year, I'm sure for all of you and for us as well. But at the same time, I'm really pleased with the progress and some of the successes we've been able to achieve on a number of our industry's key advocacy initiatives, particularly over this past year. I think most of you are aware, but BILD Alberta, as the provincial association, our main focus, the core purpose of us as an association, is to advocate on behalf of member companies with the provincial government and on matters that impact provincial policy, particularly related to housing, land development, residential construction, and renovations. So our staff works really closely with the BILD Alberta Board of Directors, our local associations, and CHBA National, really to identify our advocacy priorities that serve as the focus on our day-to-day basis when we do our work and when we talk to government. So today I do just want to spend a little bit of time kind of going over some of the work we've done over the past year, some of the successes, and then highlight the work that we are kind of continuing on from 2021 forward. And as always, our focus is housing affordability, reducing unnecessary costs and burden on your businesses, and providing increasing levels of investment uncertainty investment certainty and predictability. Really, I think our industry has shown through this pandemic that we are a pretty critical linchpin in Alberta's economy, and we are set and poised to remain one of those critical linchpins, helping Alberta come out of this pandemic and recover as a province. So I do just have a couple of slides I'll share here now and walk you through some of the work we've been doing. I'm always terrified that I have the right slide up, but I'm hoping this one says year in review. So before getting into, again, some of our more traditional advocacy items, I do want to just touch on a lot of the work we had to do and continue to do through the pandemic. First and foremost, really from March onward, one of our core focuses has been keeping construction operational through the pandemic. This took a lot of work, not only on behalf of BILD Alberta, but our local associations, and particularly member companies. This was not keeping construction operational was not and continues not to be a sure thing. As I said, it took a lot of work. We had a number of member companies step up in the early stages of the pandemic and really develop some comprehensive safety protocols and enhanced safety measures to ensure that we were preserving worker safety, providing safety to clients. And as a result of that, I was able to really communicate with government to demonstrate that our industry is going above and beyond. And as a result, we have been able to maintain operation through this process. Obviously, there's some impacts on things like offices as well as show homes. And while not perfect, I think the lion's share of our industry's work is able to kind of continue unimpeded at this time. As I mentioned, it's an ongoing item, and it's a touch point I have to make with government on an almost daily, but at least weekly basis. As we saw numbers shooting up preceding Christmas, again, there were potential issues with this. So it's something I remain constantly kind of involved with government on to make sure that we're able to kind of keep your projects moving and all that. We know in the early stages of the pandemic, our local associations also did an incredible job in working with their local municipalities to ensure your inspections move forward and all the approvals, which again was not a small task. I know a lot of people may not have been aware of this kind of in that early stages as well, but we did have a ministerial order kind of drop in our laps that basically prevented any new permits or approvals from occurring. This was in late April, early May. So it had the potential to delay all your projects, all your permits, all your approvals upwards of 6 months. It was unintended, but the policy still had the same effect. We were able to kind of tweak that and get the entire order rescinded inside a couple of weeks. So again, on top of construction and continuing, we were able to ensure that all of your projects and your approvals were able to keep going through that process. On top of that, and I know Kevin's going to touch more on this, but a lot of work was done at the national level on the financial programs to assist our member company businesses. I was privileged and had the opportunity to speak to the federal government's Standing Committee of Finance in April of last year to provide the perspective from Alberta's industry, the impacts that COVID had, and kind of reiterate some of the messaging and advocacy that Kevin was doing for changes to those financial incentives. So I want to spend a little more time now on, I guess, our advocacy successes over the past 2 years, or the past year, sorry. So if you've been following our newsletters or watched previous presentations, I think you know kind of the core piece of our advocacy really since the election of the UCP government was red tape reduction. And we've been able to kind of capture a lot of our long-standing challenges and advocacy items under the umbrella of red tape reduction. We submitted in October of 2019, 29 recommendations to government. And as of the end of 2020, we have seen legislative change on at least 7 of them, with about another 10 of them in progress with government. These are some substantial changes, and these are a lot of these items are items that we have actually been working on for 5+ years. So to actually see some change and progress on them has been really, I know, gratifying for myself, but gratifying for our member volunteers, some of them who again have been pushing on these items for 5+ years. So I'll just go over them quickly, but we always spend a lot of time on offsite levies, as it is one of the largest big ticket cost items that impact not only the land development side, but the end cost of a lot that builders buy and the end cost of a home that a consumer buys. Long-standing challenges that we've had with levies, and they're numerous, but some of them just relate to the overall transparency of how the math is done to calculate what a levy should be. And oftentimes we get little to no information on how they came up with your cost per hectare. Under the changes to the Municipal Government Act that we had in December, that transparency has substantially increased. And municipalities basically need to provide all the data, all of the information, and all of the formulas, so you, as a developer, as a builder, can actually do the math yourself to understand why that number is that number. On top of that, we've been pushing for substantial changes to accountability and disclosure of the use of levy funds. And a lot of municipalities are really good at this already, but there are some who don't maybe has as sophisticated programs. And we as an industry have really had a hard time understanding of where that money is being spent, that industry is paying for infrastructure. Is it spent for the purposes it was intended to? Is it being spent in the areas it was intended to? The annual reporting requirements for this have been substantially enhanced as part of the changes that we had in the December legislative changes, and particularly Bill 48, again, that came forward and was approved in December. Beyond that, we saw an expansion to offsite levy appeals. So historically, members have never been able to appeal levies for wastewater, water, sewer, and road infrastructure that they pay for. Your only option was to take that to the Court of Queen's Bench. It's a 4+ year process and minimum $100,000 in legal fees to go through that. Again, this is an item we've pushed for 5+ years. We now have the ability to appeal all offsite levies to the Municipal Government Board. That system alone is greatly expedited how we can take an appeal forward. It has substantially reduced the cost in doing so and provides a really important tool for our industry to challenge a municipality if they're not following the legislation appropriately. And I know these changes may not seem like a big deal to everybody on the call. You may not be as familiar with levies, but we know already, even though this just came in December, it's already paying substantial dividends in terms of the leverage and guiding the discussions that our local associations are having with their municipal partners as they review their new offsite levy bylaws. It's providing a very substantial tool that we think is going to help maintain and potentially drive down some of those costs moving forward. Past that, we know, moving on to the next one, I guess, building assessment reports. We know that that's been an annoying cost burden that any builder who does condo projects has had to deal with for a number of years. Basically has added about $800 per door for every single condo project, whether that be a multifamily building or that be even just a townhouse. So we have advocated and successfully gotten those removed as a requirement under the Condominium Property Act. That change will be enacted as of, I think it's July of this year. Under the previous government, we had broad authorities given to municipalities to determine their own legislated approval timelines. By bylaw, they could decide, well, we'll have 6 months to approve permits. We'll have 8 months to approve subdivision applications. That was the flexibility that was given municipalities under the previous government. We've had that taken out in its entirety from the Municipal Government Act, and we now have reinstated legislated approval timelines of 45 days for a development permit, 60 days for subdivision approvals. Again, that I think is going to really help provide a level of predictability to members when we look at that in combination of some of the other legislative changes that came in a couple of years ago. Inclusionary housing. This is a tool, I think most are familiar with it, where municipalities in theory could take a percentage of new development units at a discounted rate for the purposes of affordable housing. It's longstanding been an issue we've advocated against, as it effectively serves on a tax on housing to pay for housing. We have removed that from the Municipal Government Act. It does remain in place for Calgary and Edmonton through city charters, but no other municipalities can explore the use of this tool in Alberta. I'm going to touch a bit more on the Calgary and Edmonton context and city charters on the next slide. But again, this was a high priority item for us over the past 5 years. Another big win for us is we have restricted the ability for municipalities to take an additional 5% of developable land. Through the development process, municipalities can take upwards of 10% of land for reserve, whether that be schools, parks, and a few other uses. There was a clause in the MGA that also allowed municipalities to take an additional 5% of land if a project was over a certain density. And that density amount basically makes every single project that our members do eligible to have 5% additional land taken. Again, an item we've pushed for 5 years to be removed, and as of December of last year, we have formally removed that from the Municipal Government Act. Environmental approval timelines, we know they're not exactly where we want them to be, but in discussions with members, we've seen those Water Act approval timelines in particular. What I'm hearing is they've gone from that 6 to 8 month range down to 1 to 2 months in many cases. Not all cases, but in a number of those cases. We still think there's room for improvement, and over the next year, we're going to have a lot more engagement with Alberta Environment, not only on Water Act approvals, but Public Lands Act applications to, again, hopefully help streamline those and get those timelines down to an even more predictable range. Lastly, and I know it's not an item that's a big change for many of our members, but we did work with the Government of Alberta to expedite changes that allowed for 12-story wood frame construction in Alberta. That is something being done federally as well, but the changes we brought in allowed that to come in about a year sooner. We do know a number of members are not quite beginning construction on them, but are looking at starting those in the near future. Moving on into our priorities for the next year, I've got at the top, and it's easily going to be our biggest push for the next calendar year, and that is building code auto adoption. So we're working very closely with municipal affairs and a number of elected officials at the future of auto adoption for Alberta. Right now, we auto adopt the National Building Code, and it comes in typically a year after it's adopted at the national level. We have a lot of concerns with where that's headed federally, particularly as it relates to energy efficiency. And what we know is coming down are forthcoming energy step codes or tiered energy codes. A lot of our builder members are going to be quite familiar with this, but those costs to get to that kind of net zero ready level that the feds want to see by 2030 is about $55,000 in new cost per house. We've long been concerned about where that's headed and how fast it's heading there. So we've been engaging the government of Alberta saying we think a different approach is required. That approach may require us to go back to an Alberta building code, or that approach may require us to use tools like ministerial orders or variances to ensure that anything like an energy code or an energy tiered code is delayed until we do an Alberta specific assessment on that. So we remain, again, very heavily engaged with the government of Alberta on this to figure out our pathway forward. And I'm hoping we'll have kind of a resolution and a decision by the midpoint of this year. Building off of that, I think what's our board of directors has recognized is we need to also develop a more pragmatic approach to energy efficiency for our members. And particularly, we know in a lot of our municipal partners, the provincial government, federal government, their end goal is to see reductions in greenhouse gas emissions in housing. And I think a lot of our members are committed to doing that exact same thing. I think where our frustration has come is a lot of that focus has been pushed down onto new homes, where not enough consideration has been given to tackling the greater issue, which is our existing housing stock. So as a recognition of this and in an attempt to develop our own kind of pathway forward on this, we've retained Joan Maisonneuve, who was a former staff person with BILD Alberta and CHBA Alberta. We've lured her out of retirement to lead a project that develops an industry approach to reducing greenhouse gas emissions in housing. So our data shows that, again, new homes are significantly more energy efficient than what we've seen in houses even built 15 years ago. And a big focus of the work Joan's going to be doing is identifying programs, incentives, and initiatives that help tackle that existing housing stock. Because we think if you actually put the effort there, you're going to see significantly greater achievements in greenhouse gas reductions than just simply trying to tack new requirements on new homes. As part of kind of the second phase of her work, she will be looking at, again, a more pragmatic approach to getting energy efficiency into our new housing stock. That falls outside of this firm mandate from the federal government of net zero ready by 2030. So it's somewhat in its early stages, but we're looking for a preliminary report from Joan kind of this month. And then we're going to start working on the programs and incentives and have something ready for membership review kind of towards the middle of this year. I did mention city charters on the previous slide. We remain committed and advocate rather consistently with provincial government on charters. We're not asking to abolish city charters. We are simply asking to remove two of the powers that are granted to Calgary and Edmonton in it, particularly inclusionary housing and offsite levies. Again, back to my earlier point, we do not think inclusionary housing is an appropriate tool to tackle affordable housing, and are requesting that be removed entirely from city charters. Additionally, the two cities are granted rather substantial authorities related to offsite levies. We are asking that those also be removed from city charters so that the province has one consistent set of rules and standards for those costs for membership and for developments moving forward. We remain, again, reasonably optimistic that we may see some movement on this at some point this year, hopefully towards, again, June at the latest. We don't know where the decision is going to go, but we do continue to advocate regularly and I guess aggressively for those changes. We do continue to also advocate for further changes to the offsite levies regulation, particularly preventing gold-plated facilities. For instance, we know a fire hall can get built for $8 million. It gets built for about that cost in places like Leduc and some of the other smaller municipalities. But when you move to larger centers, we're seeing a fire hall cost $24 million. And a large reason behind that cost increase is spending a ton of money on the architectural treatments, adding hundreds of thousands of dollars in public art, designing the building so it's a LEED Silver or net zero standard, and all of these other items that really go beyond the core purpose of the facility. So what we want to build into the regulation is clear requirements that those charges cannot be levied against industry. If a municipality chooses to do that, that's great. But that should not be something that falls on the back of our industry to fund. Beyond that, we just want to get some additional clarity surrounding when and how things are charged, particularly for rec centers, police stations, fire halls, and libraries. And lastly, we want to put some more teeth into the regulation that prevents municipalities from basically incurring double taxation on future residents. Mainly, we know the infrastructure that we pay for and install as part of a community generates substantial property taxes, but also generates substantial revenues through utility rates and surplus revenues generated from those utilities. We believe all of that money should be kind of included and calculated as part of the overall offsite levy calculation. We will be assisting the government of Alberta in economic recovery. I think kind of a lot of what I've touched on in the previous slide and this slide is aimed at, again, reducing cost on businesses, providing more predictability for your investment, and at the same time trying to drive down and preserve housing affordability. I think there's also some great opportunities through tax incentives to encourage renovation of our existing housing stock, whether that be for energy efficiency or other matters. It's a great way to, again, generate some more work within our industry and our renovator members, while at the same time not costing the government of Alberta a significant amount of money. And I think that's something we're pretty wary of with all of our advocacy right now is we can't really be going to the provincial government asking for money or asking for reductions in taxation, because it's just that's not the reality they're in right now. So everything we look at, we always try to figure out, is there a way to make it a cost neutral program for the government of Alberta? We are continuing to focus on improving your environmental and transportation approval timelines. Again, we've seen some pretty substantial progress on the environment side. I don't think we've seen that same progress on transportation. So we're going to be engaging a lot more directly with those two ministries over the next year, because we think there's some pretty common sense ways that they can drive down those timelines and, again, provide a lot more predictability for you when you're assessing when you're going to have construction and when you want to bring a project online. Prompt payment. So I know we have talked about this. We've held a webinar on this. Not all members are familiar with it, but this is something that will impact the majority of our members. So prompt payment is effectively changes to the Builders Lien Act that will enable or requires owner companies to pay contractors and trades within 28 days of receipt of a proper invoice. We have and continue to push back on 28 days. It's a number that, in our view, is kind of picked out of thin air and just basically grabbed because that's what Ontario did. We don't think that's appropriate. We think that period should at least extend beyond a calendar month into at least 35 days, so it doesn't impact standard accounting procedures for member companies. So we've got members who are actively engaging Minister Glubish on this, while at the same time we're working with Service Alberta on a number of the regulations that are going to come out kind of within the next few months on this. And if you do want more information on prompt payment, it's, again, one file we're incredibly active on right now, and we're always looking for additional member feedback on this, and government's looking for it as well. Lastly, a project we're just going to be kicking off here shortly with our Land Development Committee is alternative infrastructure financing mechanisms. You've heard me use that term levy probably about 24 times on this call so far. Really, that's the only tool we have in place short of just direct financing from levels of government to fund infrastructure that facilitates growth. There are other jurisdictions across the globe that have found more creative ways to do this. And we're going to be doing a pretty substantial cross-jurisdictional analysis. I'm trying to flag and identify some of these tools, bring forward a set of recommendations to the government of Alberta, and in partnership with our municipal partners to try to figure out a new path forward, because we don't think the system we have right now is adequately addressing the needs not only of our industry, but of municipalities. So to wrap up, and before I kind of toss it off to Kevin, I did just want to give a very brief kind of organizational update to everybody. I'm sure many of you are aware, and many of you had to also make some tough decisions kind of from the onset of the pandemic, and BILD Alberta was very much the same. We had to make some really difficult decisions surrounding our staffing expenses and membership fees over the past year. Part of this involved an over 50% reduction in our staffing levels. We've also reduced our expenses by over 50%. While very challenging, it has put us in a much more stable position and provided us with a great deal more flexibility kind of with this year and the continued uncertainty that we're facing. We remain committed to kind of maintaining those historic expense reductions while where possible, strategically reinvesting into the organization. And in particularly, we've been able to bring on, starting in January, a Director of Policy and Government Relations, Sahib Dalet. So Sahib's background is as a senior policy analyst within the government of Alberta, and almost overnight, with bringing him on, he's almost doubled our skill base and resources to address the multitude of advocacy priorities we have in front of us and that we're going to continue to push for. We've also modified our committee structure to better engage members, the board of directors, and local associations on all of the items that we're working on. So we're getting the feedback we need to make sure that we're representing you as best as possible. I'm sure most of you or some of you on this call have attended events of ours in the past. We've had to cancel, obviously, the last 3 for obvious reasons. We continue to hope that we'll be able to put something on this fall, but that's obviously going to be largely dependent, likely on vaccination at this stage. Lara Braz, who organizes all of these events and has also become our de facto communications person through this time, has done some incredible work to minimize our exposure and penalties associated with having to cancel all these items. But we're using this time to also reevaluate what we want our conferences to look like in the future, and how best we can ensure we're providing their opportunities for education, networking, and celebration moving forward. So keep up, keep looking at our newsletters for more information of this moving forward. And just, I guess, to really wrap up, just significant thanks to all of our local association executive officers, and Kevin at the national level. I think this period has facilitated a level of collaboration across the organization that we haven't seen in some time, and it's bared significant fruit and provided significant value, I think, for your membership dollars. I think we're really firing on all cylinders, and it's substantially increased the power of our voice, I know, with the provincial government, and I don't want to speak for local associations, but I think it's helped on that front as well. And then just lastly, thanks to the BILD Alberta staff, Pam, Lara, through this period, and our boards and executive committees that we've had over the past 2 years, and Patrick Shaver and Paul Boscovich, our past and current chairs. I don't think when anybody signed up for the role, I envisioned it was going to take on the amount of work that it's required over the past year plus. And there's been a lot of really positive things happen, but it's required a lot of time and commitment from those member volunteers who, again, sit on the board, and particularly Patrick and Paul. So with that, Kevin, maybe I'll hand it over to you, and I think you should be able to share your screen. And I think there will be time for questions after if anybody does have some.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and no need to share screen. I'm going to go all verbal today. So good to see you, Scott, and you can hear me fine, I assume. Yes, and good to see lots of familiar names on the list of attendees here as well. So yeah, with respect to the crazy year that has been, obviously, much like BILD Alberta, from March on, we were really pandemic focused, starting initially a lot with the health and safety and doing a lot of coordination activity across the country. To Scott's point, I mean, we held pretty much weekly calls with the executive officers across the country through the spring and summer when things were at their most intense, and continued to meet, though a little bit less frequently through the course of the fall, just to keep everybody coordinated and sharing. And that collaboration, as Scott said, is so important to what we do as an organization. With respect to our federal advocacy and all of this, I think, with those, we can give kudos to the government to having rolled out emergency support measures very quickly. I think at least as importantly, they were also very interested in hearing from industry and what changes needed to be made, because they came out so quickly. And so we were engaged right from the start in getting adjustments. Obviously, one of the biggest things taken up by our industry and by all industries was the wage subsidy program. And when it came out with its initial eligibility criteria, it really didn't fit at all for our industry. So we got engaged right away with the Minister of Finance and his staff on getting changes to the timing for when you would compare your current state of affairs with respect to revenues to a previous period, and got that changed to allow things to be compared to January, February rather than the previous year. We got the change to the accounting method to allow a cash method for accounting versus accrual, which would make more sense, especially in the sales cycle that we have in our industry. So those were some good initial changes that we got, and a lot of our members were able to access the program as a result. And in fact, we surveyed our members and it did make a big difference. But there were a few that still were not able to access it, again, largely because of the sales cycle and involved in housing, at which point we also continued to engage on what we called fair value of contracts signed that would be more reflective of both our renovation industry and as well as our home building industry, to get more people eligible, because closings were messing up the cash flow in a positive way, and that money was coming in, but it wasn't enabling some of our members who are really suffering on the sales side to access the program. So we were getting some good traction with that. However, what also happened, I suppose, can't help but look at it in a positive way. The sector really did rebound and rebounded much stronger than anybody anticipated, both on the renovation side and on the new sales side, at which point it became very difficult to get that sort of special change that would be particularly apply to our sector, a couple of other sectors as well. But we did get some important changes there and did see the wage subsidy extended in the fall and now as well into next year. The other big one used by our industry was the emergency business account, or that loan program that enabled businesses to apply for a $40,000 loan with $10K forgivable, and then that got extended to be a $20K loan for $10K forgivable. So again, the eligibility requirements didn't make sense for many in our industry, so we were able to get the thresholds for size of business both lowered at the lower bound and raised at the higher bound, enabling many more of our members to get in. And it also enabled one of the big things that we had a challenge for, especially for our renovators, was the inability to use dividends as to count as payroll, and we were able to get that change as well. So those changes again enabled more of our members to access those programs. For those of you familiar with the emergency rent program, you know, as it came out, it was a complete disaster the way it was framed, and we fed into that extensively, and ended up getting revamped entirely. So that's been a step in a positive direction. We also, perhaps a little bit more quietly, but extensively, got engaged with respect to CERB. Just because of the challenges that our industry and many other industries were having with getting workers back to work, after, once the initial period had subsided and it was time to get back, and was able to do so safely. So we did advocate quite extensively to make some adjustments to that program and future programs to make sure we weren't creating disincentives through these subsidies to get people back to work as long as it was safe. So that was a lot of the work that we did through the spring, summer, and continued into the fall. But of course, by late spring, we were already needing to think about what would economic recovery look like. What are the things that could be done to help make sure residential construction was an important part of recovery, as it usually is. And I think we did see that very well recognized in the fall economic statement from the federal government, where there was really a shout out to the importance of residential construction and making sure it kept operating. It also rightly noted how important home ownership has been, and how many Canadians, although it's been hard for many Canadians, many others have actually managed to save money through the course of the pandemic because of keeping jobs, but working from home, having less transportation costs, et cetera, and noted that that's expected to be an important part of recovery. We know that the Bank of Canada will be keeping interest rates low for the foreseeable future until there's a complete and sustainable recovery. In fact, we're hearing now, if you've been following the news, that rates might even go down a little bit more. There's not much room for them to go down anymore, but it's all of these things are positive indicators for residential construction, especially since, as we saw through this period, home and the needs and expectations of one's home have become even greater. And we certainly saw that through the renovation activity and even the do-it-yourself activity through the course of the summer, which has posed other problems for our industry, of course, on the supply side, but I'll come back to that. The other important thing that was announced in the fall economic statement that's pretty much been direct mirroring of our recommendations for the past few years is a return to incentives for home energy retrofits. And so we were looking for a permanent tax credit or incentive program. And they came out with something that in federal government terms is practically permanent, which is a 7-year program of up to $5,000 per home. Also using the EnerGuide rating system, which we've always said is important because it drives deeper retrofits and informs consumers on what can be done. We'll also be encouraging the government to make sure that it's something that requires the maintenance of receipts, because we know we really need to fight the underground economy. Another big hurdle in the past of these programs has been the cost of the energy audits, but those are going to be apparently subsidized by the government as they plan to do as many as 1 million of these energy audits for free. So overall, something in pretty much in direct line with what we've been advocating for. And further to Scott's point, we know if we're going to address energy efficiency and climate change and GHGs in the housing sector, it needs to be done through the existing housing stock where the majority of our GHG emissions come from, and it's not about trying to ram through code a lot faster than is affordable. So that's a positive step. And there has been a commitment by this government to also provide low interest loans for deeper energy retrofits. So that comes through, that will be good. There's increased financing for their rental construction financing initiative. It was doubled, a positive step again for our industry. They expanded the first-time homebuyer incentive program, which if it was a good program would be good. It's a good nod to the importance of home ownership and getting first-time homebuyers into the market. But we have been informing the government basically since it came out that program isn't going to work, doesn't work. Unfortunately, right now, the story has been that they think it's not being taken up because of the pandemic. However, our analysis shows that it actually doesn't create any new home buyers because you can just qualify with 5% down anyway. So we continue to advocate that that program, while it can help some, needs to be supplemented by something that will actually work. And so we return to our requests for changes to mortgage rules. I should say, and Scott was alluding to us appearing before a finance committee earlier in the year. And we, of course, have been advocating for changes to the stress test for quite some time. Changes were actually announced and were to come. It got lost in the fray because it got postponed, but changes were announced last winter that there would be changes to the stress test. They were to come into effect April 6th of this past year, but got put on hold because of COVID. So we will be advocating for those to be put in place when the time comes. But in the meantime, of course, the low interest rate environment is really muting the impact of the stress test. So we at least have that for the next little while. So that is good. One sort of cautionary note from the fall update was the vacancy tax that is being contemplated by the government. Much like BC's vacancy tax, we'll be active on that file. A foreign investor tax on vacant units probably isn't a horrible thing in most marketplaces, given what it does to limit supply, which is one of our biggest challenges. But we want to make sure it's done right, and we also want to make sure it doesn't apply to vacation homes, because many areas have vacation homes that are an important part of the local market. The other thing we've been advocating for is the importance of a return to strong immigration, and that also has been announced with a goal even as starting this year, 2021, of targeting 400,000 immigrants, which no doubt under the current circumstances will be difficult, but it's good to see that they are looking to get back to that, because we know that's so important both to housing demand as well as to our labor shortages. We also have been engaged with the federal government on the importance of modular housing, and that was also announced through the Rapid Housing Initiative, trying to get 3,000 new homes in place for emergency, transitional, and social and affordable housing. And so we've been engaged in that to get that rolling out. So Overall, from an advocacy perspective, a lot of things falling in line with what we've been recommending. I cannot disagree with the concern that Alberta is expressing over the federal plans for the National Building Code, especially as it pertains to energy. We, of course, spent a ton of time working on the National Building Code and fighting on your behalf on things that don't make sense. This has been one of them. So we're heavily engaged in the energy side of it. I will say that the statement, the false statement, talked about two things. One is a new model code for retrofits, which will be a big challenge for any provincial government, and the provincial governments do have the jurisdiction. They're the ones who would put that in place. And as we saw when Ontario was starting to try and do that, this will finally have the impact that I think our industry has been long screaming about, which is the impact of price on such renovations. And so I think that moving forward with this retrofit code, as they try to do it, is really going to shed light on the really high costs that come with trying to do these things ahead of their time. And so our advocacy has very much been about, our industry knows how to build more energy efficient houses. We've been doing it for a long time, and we will continue to do so. But that needs to be on a voluntary basis until such time as it's not impacting on affordability. So if you really want to go this route, you need innovation. And one of the things that was mentioned in the fall economic statement, and it was sort of buried, but it's critically important. I'm certainly hanging my hat on it. And it is, and I'll read verbatim, codes are critical to ensuring that buildings are constructed or renovated to be as energy efficient as technically and economically possible. So that's the first time I've seen from this government a talk about the economic impacts and the challenges with cost. So we will continue to work on that. All of our work on building code always features work on costs and pushing for cost impacts. And I can also tell you that PTPAC, which is the Provincial and Territorial Advisory Committee that informs the Code Commission at the national level, has indicated that housing affordability is a priority and needs to be thought of. So we will continue to push, and there is some momentum. So hopefully we can slow things down to the point where innovation can catch up and any steps forward on energy efficiency don't impact on affordability. I should also mention that we don't just work on code. We are engaged on all kinds of standards as well that are called up by code, codes from CSA, codes from CGSB, and we fight the same fight there on affordability and making sure things make sense. On the positive side, on energy efficiency, we do, of course, have our own net zero home labeling program, and we have many leading builders in Alberta that are participating in that program, where we show how to do it on a voluntary basis, which also gives us the information to fight back and talk about the costs of trying to put that into code. So just before Christmas, we surpassed over 500 homes labeled in that program, which is great news. We're piloting a multi-unit program, low-rise multi-unit initiative right now. We're piloting renos. We have a new training program for renovators available. So any renovators on the call that haven't heard of that, I would encourage you to take a look at your net zero training for renovation. And all of this also gives us some ability to push back against code as well, as I mentioned. There's also quite a bit of work going on climate change resiliency and codes and standards. And so we're engaged in all of that: wind, flooding, wildfire, obviously a challenge in Alberta. So we're engaged in all of those efforts and we'll continue to do so. Obviously, one of the most important things going on these days in our industry is a shortage of supply. The positive side of the story is demand for housing in most places across the country, and that has continued to grow. The challenge has been on the supply side of materials, and probably nothing is worse in terms of supply than the lumber issue, which has been front and center. We've been active on this as soon as it started to hint it was going in this direction in midsummer. And so we've been engaged with government on making sure all levels of government do as much as they can to keep that supply chain running, which also includes the transportation portion of that supply chain, which has been a big challenge since before the pandemic and is exacerbating things and has through the course of the recent months. We've done a fair amount of media work as well, not only to inform government, but just as important for our members, to inform consumers. about why the price of their house might be going up or the price of their rental might be going up, and that it's not something that our members can control or are responsible for, but of course does need to be reflected in the prices of jobs. So we did quite a bit of work on that. As expected, the prices did come down in October as all the mills got back open and started to catch up. But unfortunately, demand for housing has continued to keep strong. A weird thing to say from our industry perspective, but when you talk about lumber, that's true. And of course, very importantly, that's both north and south of the border. And so we've seen escalating prices again. They're right back up. We are engaged with the House of Commons Committee on Natural Resources that is currently doing a study on the recovery of the forestry sector, because certainly the pulp and paper side of things is really suffering. So we have submitted to them about the importance of dealing with the supply side of lumber, especially as it pertains to residential construction. We did a lot of good work in getting 6-story wood into the code. I know at the provincial and national levels, we're doing work on getting 12-story wood into the code, and this committee is encouraging that. But of course, we can't build 12-story wood if we can't get wood for low-rise construction as we have right now. So we encourage them to do everything they can to get access on a long-term basis to have a more steady market and less volatility in the lumber market if we can get more supply. And we're also working with our U.S. colleagues at NAHB who are doing similar advocacy with the U.S. government to try and get access to more. And we recognize too that there are also supply chain issues on many other products in the system right now. So we are engaging on that front. We did a municipal benchmarking study this past year, comparing and contrasting municipalities on their efforts with respect to affordability and supply. And so that was quite an innovative project that got quite a bit of take up. The good news is you're doing pretty well in Alberta, especially, in places like Calgary and Edmonton with respect to what your cities are doing, which I know sounds astounding to you. But compared to other places in the country, let's just say it could be worse. But we also know that because of that, we don't want to give excuses to places like Calgary and Edmonton to not keep going, to keep doing better and better. And so we are working on our fact sheets to enable us to add a little bit more to those fact sheets and a more local flavor about what else can be done. So we are working on that element to add a new piece to those studies to make sure that nobody tries to rest on their laurels moving forward. As we talk about getting more innovation into our sector and more new technologies, especially around the energy efficiency, so we can address the affordability issues, stay tuned. Some of you may have participated in Natural Resources Canada's LEAP program that works with builders to help identify promising new technologies and introduce them to them, test them out, get feedback, and help builders learn from each other on what worked, what didn't. It's been a very successful program that we've advocated for continuing over the years, and we've gotten more funding to it over the years. We're currently in the throes of finalizing a relationship with NRCan, which will help us deliver a bunch more of those directly through the association, through CHBA, and then through our local and provincial associations. So we're quite excited about bringing that to the membership across the country looking forward. So we continue to do all of our meetings, of course, as we always do with ministers and MPs and appearing before the House of Commons and Senate committees on a variety of things, be it Finance Committee, Natural Resources, Human Resources, on the importance of getting more skilled trades, to advocate on your behalf for voicing your priorities. I'm actually meeting tomorrow with Erin O'Toole, of course, the leader of the Conservative Party and leader of the official opposition. And in case you hadn't heard, the pundits are predicting right now that the Liberal government will table a budget sometime around March, probably, and that it is likely not to be supported in the House, which could lead to a spring election. So stay tuned. That's obviously not a certainty, but we are starting to gear up for what a campaign would look like if that ended up happening. So I don't want to go too much longer because I know we wanted to leave time for some questions and answers, but hopefully you're following things through our national update newsletter. And if you don't know, we do provide industry highlights of what's going on across the country in the media, as well as our commentary on it. Actually, every single day we have an email that goes out on industry highlights. And I always say we send it out every day because we don't expect you to read it every day. But whenever you want the latest, it's there at your fingertips. And if you don't get that, you can just email us at communications@chba.ca to keep up with everything that the national office is doing. So with that, Scott, maybe I'll close. Happy to talk about anything else I didn't cover or take any questions anybody might have, and I guess they might have questions for you as well.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Kevin. That was great. Yeah, so I mean, people don't feel shy. If you'd want to unmute yourself to ask questions, feel free. Also, if you prefer to just type it out, if you're a little shy, you can do that in the chat box to the right. Looks like Greg may have one.
Yeah.
Oh, there's a shy guy.
Shy guy. I'm the shyest guy on the call. Good report by both. Very exhaustive list, and it's great stuff. I brought up a little while ago, Kevin, and I'm not trying to trap you on this, but I'm still, of course, because a lot of my focus is on seniors housing and care. Given the fact that the last 9-10 months have been a calamity, a tragedy of epic proportions in Canada, and I still carry forward with the premise that there's an opportunity or a role for the housing industry to improve seniors' care and housing. And I pick on Ontario, not because you're from Ontario or we innately in Alberta have this burning desire to do so, but there is, for those on the call who don't know, I'm sure they've been inundated with media reports on long-term care and housing and tragedies from the seniors industry, particularly in Ontario and to a lesser degree in Quebec. There's 38,000 people on wait lists in Ontario. So while there's a general housing shortage, I put a comment on LinkedIn and Facebook last week. It was about, you might have seen the story, Kevin, it was about care workers living in homeless shelters because they couldn't afford housing. And those care workers were from Ottawa. So I commented on the connectivity between affordable housing, providing housing for service workers, and the quality of care and service that we believe we have in Alberta, and suggesting that it was a train wreck in Ontario, partly because they don't have housing for service workers, partly because governments have gone brain dead on the supply side, and they've applied pretty much an institutional approach to building seniors housing. So much of the public sentiment's been fanned around hospitals and acute care. And in Alberta, hospitals are costing $4 and up to $8 million per bed. And governments realize the value proposition isn't there. And they're taking up to 8 years to build. And in the long-term care side, in building codes, great work on the 6-story and the 12-story on C occupancy residential. But in the seniors area, we're still at B2 and B3, which is 2 and 3 stories wood. So the residential, I believe, can be a very safe built form because of the sprinkling, particularly with firewalls and some fairly modest design changes. Yet, I don't think we're at the table talking to government. I think, I know in Ontario, they're talking about 1.8 or $1.75 billion for new long-term care. They're talking about, I can't remember what the number was, 30,000, I believe, new beds. I'm a little confused by that number as an aside, because that's only 58,000 per bed. And it's typically costing 300,000, 400,000, 500,000 plus. So anyways, I draw your attention back to that because in Ontario at the provincial level, I'm wondering if the onus is more on me to follow up on this than you gentlemen, but I want to just put forward the fact that this is probably the biggest housing issue related to health and safety that's happened in my tenure. And I think we could come forward with positive suggestions around built form and operating models like home care, as opposed to institutional models. In Ontario, for those on the call who don't know, a lot of the existing nursing homes are up to 4 people per room sharing occupancy, common dining rooms, and there, in my opinion, is a relationship between the built form, the care, the age of the facility, and a tremendous number of fatalities that are happening across the country, but particularly in Ontario. So anyways, I'll keep bringing that up.
Yeah. Yeah, no, and that's fair. And you know, I'll leave the specific Ontario situation for OHBA, the Ontario Home Builders, to address, like you said, and I think you have spoken to them, but you're absolutely right. Of course, being in Ottawa, I'm on the border between Quebec and Ontario, both of which were not so great through the pandemic. I'll just add that, of course, what we are doing at the national level is we have our Home Modification Council, and we're getting set to launch a completely new initiative. We were working with NAHB, adapting their CAPS program to Canada, ran that in a few pilots, and have decided it needs a major revamping to be better for renovators, needs to be shorter, frankly, ideally less time in the classroom and that. So we're sort of revamping that, but looking to put together a training program, a recognition program as well, so that homeowners and caregivers, especially who need to care for seniors but want to be able to do that in homes, can make those renovations. So that's a big thrust for us over the coming year, and so look forward to seeing much more on that in the coming months.
Yeah, and I think provincially, Greg, you're doing a great job of pushing this with the provincial government, and I appreciate you kind of looping me in on a lot of those conversations that you're having. I think coming out of this, there's going to be opportunities and a willingness to explore solutions across the housing spectrum that governments maybe weren't interested in before. And we absolutely need to position ourselves to be ready to have those conversations with thoughtful information and perspectives, because I think there's going to be a lot of, as I said, a lot of opportunity in the next 6 to 12 months in Alberta, and I think across Canada.
And just to pound home the final point, if we can't get their attention after this pandemic, when are we going to get their attention?
Yeah, that's very true. Did anybody else? I'm not seeing anything in the chat, but if anybody else has a question, feel free to unmute yourself and speak up. Okay, it doesn't look like we have any more. So again, sincere appreciation for everybody taking a little time out of your day to hear a bit more about what's happening within the industry, what we're working on provincially and at the national level. Lara has recorded this video. We're going to make sure we have that available on our website. So a link will be sent out to all members, I think, towards the end of this month with our normal monthly newsletter. And yeah, again, thanks to everybody for your time today. And if you have questions, never hesitate to reach out to myself. And I know Kevin's typically available as well to answer any. So yeah, thanks again, everybody. And Kevin, thanks a lot for taking some time to kind of speak to us today too.
Pleasure. Anytime, Scott.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.